in the coastal village of Lirael, where the land kissed the sea with tender reverence and the sky curved low as if to listen, life unfolded in quiet wonder. The village sat on a crescent of land that cradled the bay like a sleeping child. Its homes, made of driftwood and stone, leaned into the wind like old friends whispering secrets to the horizon. The scent of brine and blooming salt roses hung in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of cedar smoke and sun-dried rope. Time in Lirael was not measured by clocks, but by the tides and stars. Fishermen woke not to alarms, but to the silver glint of the moon as it sank beneath the water. Children returned home when the sky turned the color of tangerine and shadows stretched long and soft across the dunes. The village held its breath in harmony with the sea. It was a place where silence spoke louder than words, and every breeze seemed to carry the echo of something ancient and important. And in this place, half forgotten by the world, half remembered by dreams, lived a girl named Holly. The morning light rolled softly over the cliffs of Lirael, brushing the rooftops and whispering across the tide pools like a secret shared only with those who truly listened. Hallie stood barefoot at the water's edge, the damp sand cool beneath her feet, her notebook held loosely in one hand. Her eyes scanned the distant horizon, but not for ships or seabirds. She was listening. The melody had changed that morning. It was subtle, just a shift in pitch, a deeper undercurrent beneath the familiar refrain. Like a second voice had joined the first, faint but distinct. She'd felt it before she'd even opened her eyes. A quiet stirring in her chest, like a thread tugging her forward, asking her to follow. She wandered further than usual, past the tide, worn rocks and kelp draped shore, to a cove where children rarely played, and where the waves moved slower, more deliberately. There, nestled between two barnacle-covered stones, was something strange. A shell, unlike any she had ever seen. It shimmered with a pearly hue that shifted colors in the light, violet, silver, and a soft sea glass green. Intricate ridges circled its edge, carved with patterns that looked more like runes than natural formations. She picked it up gently, brushing sand from its curves. It was warm to the touch, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat, and when she held it to her ear, the song came rushing in, not faint, not whispering, but full, vibrant, alive. The sound enveloped her completely. It was layered and complex, melodies within melodies, like hundreds of voices braided together. But more than that, it felt directed, like the ocean was not merely singing, but speaking, and it was speaking to her. She staggered back slightly, the sensation overwhelming, and the shell slipped from her hand, landing in the sand without a sound. The music stopped. Hallie stared at it, heart racing, unsure whether to be frightened or exhilarated. She knelt again, carefully picking it up once more. No sound came this time, but the warmth remained. That night, Hallie couldn't sleep. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, the shell on her pillow beside her. The song echoed in her thoughts, rising and falling with every breath. At some point, she drifted into a half-sleep, and in that liminal space between dreams and waking, she saw it. A great shape beneath the waves, ancient and vast, moving through the depths with a slow, deliberate grace. It called to her, not with words, but with music. A thread of the song she'd known all her life, now clearer, stronger. When she awoke, the sun had not yet risen, but she knew what she had to do. She dressed quietly, tucking the shell into a cloth pouch and tying it around her neck. She left a note for May and her mother, not explaining much, just that she had to follow something. As she stepped outside, the sky was beginning to pale. The village still slept, unaware that something had shifted. Hallie moved with purpose, her feet finding the path instinctively. The melody was in her blood now, guiding her. She returned to the cove, the shell clutched tightly in her hand. The tide had risen, covering the place where she'd found it. But she didn't hesitate. She walked into the surf, the waves curling around her ankles, knees, waist. Just when she thought she might need to turn back, a pulse shot through the shell, a gentle thrum against her chest, and the water around her shimmered. A doorway opened beneath the surface, not made of stone or light, but of sound. The notes formed a spiral, drawing her in, and before she could second guess, she let herself fall forward into the music. Everything disappeared. The world became song, and in that song, a new journey began. The world was quieter after the plunge. Not silent, never silent, but hushed in the way a room grows still when something sacred enters. Holly opened her eyes slowly, expecting salt and darkness, but finding herself drifting through a current made of music and light. The waters around her were neither cold nor wet. They hummed, alive with memory, wrapping around her like the embrace of a story long untold. Her limbs moved effortlessly, not swimming, but following the gentle pull of the melody that called her deeper into its embrace. She could not see the bottom, nor the sky above, only layers of shifting blue and green that seemed to fold in and out of one another like breath. Time unraveled in this place. Moments stretched and dissolved like waves upon waves. She passed through arches formed by living coral that pulsed with soft light. She saw shapes moving in the distance, vast silhouettes with wings of shimmer and song, creatures ancient and undisturbed. Some watched her. None came close. They too were listening. At last, the current released her gently at the edge of a great dome, a hollow carved not into stone, but into music itself. As she stepped forward, the waters parted, and she stood dry on a path that formed beneath her feet, made of seashells and memory. In the center of the dome stood a figure, not tall, not imposing, but radiant. She wore robes woven from kelp and cloud, and her hair floated as though the tide had never left it. Her eyes shimmered not with color, but with memory, and when she spoke, her voice sounded like the hush of waves and the rise of song. "Welcome, Holly," she said, her voice a chord both new and impossibly old. "I am Mandy." Hallie blinked. Mandy smiled. "I am the Tide Keeper, the one who guards the forgotten songs. And you, child of shoreline and shadow, have heard what others forgot to remember." Hallie opened her mouth, but her voice felt too small for the space. Still the words came.
Why me?
Mandy's smile softened. "Because you listened, because you remembered, and because the sea remembers you." Mandy gestured toward a pool at the center of the dome. Within it danced flickers of dreams, images and sounds and fragments of stories. "These are echoes,"
Mandy said.
"not ghosts, not lives, just songs waiting for a voice." Hallie stepped closer. She saw a mother singing to her child, lost to time, a sailor whispering to the stars, a village beneath the sea that once wove stories into nets. She felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, but from the sheer beauty of it. "What do I do?" she asked. Mandy placed a shell into her hand, not the one from before, but another. This one was darker, etched with spirals that shifted as she breathed. "You carry them. You remember them. You become the song. The pool began to glow, and the dome filled with a low harmony, ancient and wordless. The floor beneath her shimmered. Hallie looked down and saw the outline of her own story unfolding, her drawings in the sand, her walks in the mist, the first time she heard the melody. She saw the lonely girl who wandered and waited, the girl who followed the song. But I'm just a girl, and that is more than enough. Mandy lifted her hand, and the threads of light that filled the dome slowly wove themselves around Hallie's shoulders like a cloak. You are the listener, the weaver, and it is time you learned to guide. The dome dissolved around them, not shattered, not broken, but released. The waters returned, but this time they carried her upward, slowly, as if lifting her not through space, but through understanding. She surfaced near the cove, the morning sun just beginning to rise. The shell in her hand still pulsed, the song quieter now, but deeper. Hallie stood, the waves brushing her calves, and looked toward the shore. She wasn't sure how long she had been gone, or if time had passed at all. But something had changed. The village had not noticed yet. The world still slept. But she knew the melody had welcomed her. The song had chosen her, and she, who had once only listened, now held a voice filled with stories ready to be sung. The days that followed her return from the dome were quiet, but not in the way of silence. Rather, they were filled with a stillness that felt alive. Hallie moved through them as though she were half dreaming, half awake, seeing everything with a new softness. The village of Lirel looked the same nets drying in the breeze, the same laughter of children echoing across the dunes, the same gentle creak of boats rocking in their moorings. But beneath it all, something had shifted. The rhythm of the tide had become something she could feel inside her chest, pulsing gently alongside her own heartbeat. She no longer just heard the sea, she felt it. It was as though it had taken up residence inside her, or perhaps revealed that it had always been there. May noticed first. One evening, as they sat together on the worn bench outside their cottage, sipping warm elderflower tea and watching the moon rise slow over the water, May turned to her and said, "You're not waiting anymore." Haley looked at her, startled. "What do you mean?" May smiled, slow and wise. "You used to listen for something, like your ears were always tilted toward something far away. But now it's different. Now it's like the sea listens back." Haley didn't know how to answer that, so she only nodded because May was right. Something had changed. The days began to blur in the way only sacred time can, when the mind drifts from the weight of hours and surrenders to rhythm. Hallie awoke each morning with the shell still warm against her chest, as though it had been breathing in sync with her through the night. Her dreams now carried her farther, beyond the dome, beyond Mandy's chamber, into open seas of memory, where voices no longer needed words. She was learning to read the currents not with her eyes, but with her senses. When the wind turned cool and briny, she knew it carried a message. When birds circled high and silent, she felt a thread of change. She had become a quiet sentinel of tides and tone, and with each passing day, the villagers of Lirel noticed the way she moved, as though she stepped not on earth, but across a web of melody. Some whispered that she had sea, magic in her blood. Others said she had gone strange, too much time alone with winds and salt. But the children, they knew. They watched her from behind dune grass, their small eyes full of wonder, feeling what adults forgot to see. On the seventh morning after her last journey with Mandy, the sea left something on the shore for Holly. It was not a message in a bottle or a gift wrapped in weed and shell. It was a book, waterlogged and barnacled, its pages stuck together, but pulsing faintly with something more than ink. She carried it to the stone of listening, dried it gently with her cloak, and waited for the tide to speak. And speak it did. The book came alive in her hands. As she opened the swollen cover, the shell at her side began to hum. Not in song, but in memory. Each page revealed not words, but sensations, heat, sorrow, colors without names, the rhythm of someone else's heartbeat. The book was a vessel of lost emotion, a shipwreck of someone's forgotten self. Hallie sat for hours with it, unmoving, letting its contents flow into her. She didn't try to understand it with her mind. She let her spirit do the listening. By sunset, she knew whose story it was. A woman who once lived in L'Oreal, long before Holly's time. A healer who could not heal herself. Who gave everything away until there was nothing left. Who had walked into the sea with empty hands and had not returned. Until now. Holly brought the book back to Mandy. They sat together beneath the moonlit cove, and Mandy placed both hands over the open pages. "She has been waiting," Mandy said softly. "And you heard her," Hallie nodded. "What do we do?" "We remember her," Mandy said. "We say her name again." But her name had been erased by time. No inscription remained, no trace in the village records. Only the sea remembered. And so, together, Hallie and Mandy wrote her a new name. One carried on the breath of Song Alwyn, which meant light returned. They sang it into the tide. They wove it into the loom. And that night, the stars above L'Oreal burned brighter, and for the first time in decades, the waves at the shoreline curled not in sorrow, but in peace. From that day on, Hallie found other objects the sea returned. Stones etched with dreams, feathers soaked in song, mirrors that reflected not the face, but the soul. Each carried a story, each was a thread, and as she gathered them, she began to see the shape of something greater. A tapestry of remembering, too vast for one heart, but not for many. Mandy told her of the dreaming isles, scattered like pearls across the horizon, where other weavers had once lived. Most had vanished into legend. Some, perhaps, were still listening. Hallie would find them, but not yet. First, she would teach others how to listen. She would start with the children, whose hearts still beat to the rhythm of wonder. She would give them shells and songs and spaces to be still. And one day, perhaps, one of them would find a melody beneath the waves and follow it and meet the sea halfway. And the remembering would begin again. The wind changed on the seventh morning, not in strength or direction, but in tone. It no longer whispered through the grasses or sighed through the stones. Now it called gently, but unmistakably. Holly stood on the cliffs above the sea, her hair dancing around her face, and she knew the call was for her. The shell at her chest pulsed more steadily now, a rhythm that mirrored the tide, and when she pressed it to her ear, the song had deepened, its melody layered with voices she could almost understand. She descended from the cliffs and followed the shoreline past familiar rocks and forgotten coves, led by instinct and sound. When she reached the place where the water ran darkest and the air shimmered faintly with salt light, Mandy was already waiting. She stood still, her robes catching the breeze like sails, her presence neither loud nor commanding, but undeniable. Without speaking, she gestured to a narrow inlet flanked by stones carved with spiral symbols. Hallie followed, her feet pressing into cool sand, as the water lapped at her ankles. They walked together until the inlet gave way to an open basin, hidden deep within the cliffs, where the tide never reached and the sky looked far away. Here, Mandy knelt and placed her hands on the surface of a still pool, which responded by glowing faintly beneath her touch. This is the listening pool.
She said.
It remembers the ones who forgot their own stories. Hallie knelt beside her, placing the shell on the water's surface. Immediately, visions swirled to life, flickers of dreams never dreamt to their end, songs sung in silence, fragments of people and places and things that had drifted too far to find their way back. Mandy touched Hallie's shoulder. You can call them home, not with words, but with being. And so Hallie sat still for hours, perhaps days, letting the echoes pass through her. One by one, the dreams settled and softened, as if her presence alone offered them rest. When she finally rose, the shell was brighter, and her heart was full, not of answers, but of peace. She turned to Mandy and whispered, "I'm ready for what's next." Mandy only smiled, the kind of smile that knew the road ahead would ask much, but give more. Together, they left the basin, the water behind them now still and luminous, holding in its depths the quiet promise of all things heard and remembered. The sea was no longer a stranger, and Hallie no longer hesitated when its voice called her. She rose before the sun, her footsteps silent through the dew, slicked grass, her thoughts calm but expectant. The shell vibrated with a softness that reminded her of a lullaby half remembered from childhood. She followed its pull to the edge of the world, or so it felt, where the cliffs dropped into the roaring sea below. But this time there was no fear. The path she took shimmered faintly under her feet, a glowing thread only visible to those who listened. As she stepped beyond the last familiar stone, the air thickened with something sacred. There, where the sea met sky in quiet ceremony, stood a gate made of woven coral and starlight. It pulsed like a heartbeat, and at its center hovered a circle of mirrored water, perfectly still despite the wind all around. Mandy waited beside it, robes trailing like mist. "This is where the dream deepens," she said, her voice barely more than the movement of tide over shell. Hallie nodded, not needing explanation. Together they stepped through the gate, and at once the world changed. The space beyond was vast and soundless, filled with drifting lights like floating seeds. Here, time bent and folded. Stories hovered mid-bloom, incomplete, forgotten. Mandy led her to a strand of light, fragile and flickering. "This one belongs to someone who has not yet been born," she said. Hallie reached out, touched it gently, and the story unfolded. A world of floating gardens, a child with golden eyes, laughter echoing through clouds. She didn't question how or why she saw it. She simply honored it. That became her task in this place, to walk the strands of half-made dreams, to witness, to hum them into wholeness. Some were joyful, some were heavy, but all deserved to be known. When she finally emerged, it was dusk above the cliffs. The wind was still. The shell now sang not just to her, but through her, and the sea, once distant and mysterious, now felt like home. When the twilight fell upon the echoing isles that evening, it carried with it a hush so profound that even the sea stilled its waves to listen. Hallie stood near the great pool of starlight, watching its surface shimmer with reflections not her own. The shell's glow was steady now, no longer pulsing with uncertainty, but radiating quiet purpose. She knew something was coming, something ancient, something that had waited for countless cycles of tide and time to be remembered. That night, the shell hummed with a different vibration. She could feel it not just in her hand, but in the very marrow of her bones. When she closed her eyes, the song returned, not in fragments, but whole, enveloping her in its melody like the arms of an old friend. It told of a memory buried deep within the sea, an ancient promise unfulfilled, and a call that only she could answer. Mandy met her near the water's edge before dawn, her expression calm, her robe rippling as if stirred by an invisible current. "It is time," she said simply. Together, they followed the winding trail toward the shore, where a boat waited, not made of wood or cloth, but of woven light and thread. As they stepped in, the sea did not ripple. It welcomed them, folding gently around the vessel, lifting it as if it had always known they would come. The journey was silent, yet filled with resonance. Shapes flickered beneath the waves, shadows of dreams, echoes of voices long lost. Above them, stars shifted in patterns unseen by any astronomer, constellations written in forgotten languages. They sailed until the horizon opened into a vast, circular chamber made entirely of water suspended in air. Here, the hearthrug resided. It pulsed like a second sun, casting no shadow, only illumination. Holly stepped forward alone, the shell glowing with a fierce light now. She reached out. The moment her fingers brushed the hearthrug, time unraveled. She saw the origin of the melody. She saw the first listener, the first weaver, the first shell-shaped echo that called through generations. And she saw herself, not as a girl on the shore, but as a thread woven into the vast pattern of all things. She did not cry. There were no tears here, only awe. And when the light dimmed, the thread in her palm had changed, no longer just a memory, now a purpose. As they sailed back toward the waking world, Mandy placed a hand on Hallie's shoulder. "The sea does not forget," she said, "and now neither will you." The path of light beneath Hallie's feet pulsed with each step she took, unfolding into the dark like a ribbon of breath woven from starlight. She no longer questioned where it led. She trusted it the way one trusts the pull of tide or the hush of dusk. The air around her shimmered gently, thick with dreams not yet formed and voices that hadn't spoken in lifetimes. Her fingers brushed the thread she carried, the golden strand gifted by the hearthrug itself, and it sang to her with the quiet certainty of belonging. As she walked, the space around her transformed, not into a place, but a presence. It was not light or dark, but something deeper, an awareness woven from memory and music. Then she saw it, a shape suspended in the air, like a bell made of mist and memory, spinning slowly. The hearthrug had left her a map, and the map had led her home. She reached for the shape and was met by warmth. Not heat, but the kind of warmth one feels in the first hug after a long absence. The moment her fingers made contact, visions surged through her, not stories, but truths. Faces she had never seen and yet somehow remembered. Songs without melody that still found harmony in her bones. Pain that did not belong to her, but had always been part of her world. And still she stood steady, her body a vessel, her heart a lighthouse. The golden thread around her wrist pulsed in rhythm, and she began to hum. No words, just breath, tone, meaning. It was enough. The shape dissolved into light, and Holly found herself once again at the edge of the sea. The cliffs behind her, the vastness before. But now she was not just Holly of Lyral. She was Holly of the threads, Holly of the dream keepers, Holly the remembered. And with her song still glowing in her chest, she turned toward the distant shore, knowing the story had only just begun. Dawn rose slowly over the echoing isles, as though it, too, had been waiting for something. The sky unfolded in a hush of lavender and pearl, and the sea mirrored its stillness perfectly. Hallie stood near the edge of the water, the shell in her hand now quiet, but still warm, a final heartbeat of the song that had carried her through the deep. She closed her eyes and listened in, not for instruction, not for guidance, but simply to remember. Behind her, the threads of memory she had gathered over her journey pulsed softly, woven into the land, into the trees, into the quiet laughter of the waves. She could feel them, all the dreams she had touched, the ones she had held and mended, the ones still floating gently through the oceans of thought. She knelt and pressed the shell gently into the sand, a gesture of thanks, of release. It pulsed once more, then fell still, its glow fading into the morning light. She didn't need it anymore. The song was inside her now. Mandy stood a short distance away, not watching but waiting, her expression unreadable but calm. Hallie joined her, and together they walked one last time along the shoreline, the wind weaving around them in quiet celebration. There were no words. None were needed. As they reached the small hill that overlooked the bay, the village came into view, hushed and peaceful, its rooftops catching the new light. The people of Lyral would soon wake, and with them, the dreams Hallie had helped awaken. Some would rise remembering pieces of music they had never heard before. Others would find new meaning in old stories, and many would simply feel, for the first time in a long time, that they belonged to something vast and kind. Hallie paused, breathing in the scent of salt and sun. Her journey had brought her full circle, yet nothing was the same. She was not just a listener now. She was a bearer of echoes, a weaver of forgotten songs, a voice for what had once been silent. And somewhere, far across the sea, a new dream stirred. She smiled, and then, like the tide, she moved forward, into morning, into memory, into whatever waited next.